Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Everything Answer Book, How Quantum Science Explains Love, Death, and the Meaning of Life, by Amit Goswami, Ph.D., narrated by Runnette. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit Tantor.com and type The Everything Answer Book into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page, then under the Supplemental Content section, please enter the access code EXPLORATION, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. Introduction. Almost 100 years have passed since the complete mathematical formulation of quantum physics. It has been verified by myriad experiments, and its concepts have been successfully applied in many technologies. Indeed, we have begun to use the word quantum in our daily discourse, often without fully understanding its deeper meaning. And yet, despite its effective integration into our society, the quantum worldview has still not been fully accepted by the scientific community, which continues to espouse and defend the archaic Newtonian worldview. Consequently, the full implications of the quantum worldview have not yet penetrated the public mind. The good news is that in the 1990s, thanks to the efforts of an avant-garde group of renegade scientists, including myself, the quantum worldview began to mature and give birth to an all-inclusive new scientific paradigm. The grassroots movement known as quantum activism has begun to dislodge the stranglehold of Newtonian physics on the scientific establishment by appealing directly to people. This book is a part of that movement and the latest popular exposition of the quantum worldview. Part of the mischief derives from circumstances. The prevailing Newtonian paradigm was always fraught with paradoxes. Officially known as scientific materialism, this worldview proposed that everything exists merely as a phenomenon of matter, material movement in space and time caused by material interaction. The paradoxes implicit in this view were never resolved. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that scientific materialism came under serious scrutiny by the scientific community, prompted by new experimental data. Previously, the worldview of scientific materialism was much aided by the shift of physics away from a philosophy-oriented European approach to the more pragmatic American approach that followed World War II. Before the 1950s, scientific materialism was firmly entrenched only in the disciplines of physics and chemistry, the science of inanimate objects. After the 1950s, it also began to dominate biology, which became chemistry, the health sciences, which became almost mechanical, and eventually psychology, which became cognitive neuroscience. The second party to the mischief was the inadvertent enthusiasm of well-meaning scientists to close off the debate surrounding the meaning of quantum physics as quickly as possible. So a compromise, dubbed famously, or should I say infamously, the Copenhagen interpretation, was reached. This interpretation was pioneered by the famous and amicable Niels Bohr, whom every physicist, including myself, worshipped. The centerpiece of the Copenhagen interpretation is called the complementarity principle, which, in its popularized form, is simply wrong, both theoretically and experimentally. Quantum mathematics says unequivocally that quantum objects are waves, but of course experiments say that they are also particles. How can the same object be both a wave, something that spreads out, and a particle, something that travels in a defined trajectory? The popular form of the complementarity principle resolves this wave-particle paradox by claiming that quantum objects are both waves and particles. The wave aspect is revealed in wave-measuring experiments. The particle aspect is revealed in particle-measuring experiments. But both aspects never show up in the same experiment, and are thus called complementary. However, the correct answer to the paradox of wave-particle duality, both theoretically and experimentally, is this: quantum objects are waves of possibility residing in a domain of reality outside of space and time, called the domain of potentiality. Whenever we measure these objects, they reveal themselves as particles in space and time, so both the wave and the particle aspects of an object can, in fact, be detected in a single experiment. Unfortunately, the popularized version of the complementarity principle, which created the impression that the wave and particle aspects of an object both exist in space and time, misled an entire generation or two of physicists and caused them to close their minds to the really radical elements of quantum physics. In fact, quantum physics insists on a two-level reality, not the single space-time reality of Newtonian physics and scientific materialism. Moreover, quantum physics cannot possibly be made paradox-free without explicitly invoking consciousness. But of course it was the role of consciousness that kept the paradox alive, not in the mainstream, but in a cultish sort of way. In the 1980s, an experiment by Alain Aspect and his collaborators resolved the issue of a dual versus a single domain of reality by discerning the domain of potentiality from the domain of space and time. In the former, no signal is needed for communication. Everything is instantaneously interconnected. By contrast, in space and time, signals, always moving with a speed no greater than the speed of light, mediate communication, which always occurs in finite time. What does it mean to say that the domain of potentiality is all instantaneously interconnected? Simply this: everything in the domain of potentiality is one entity. In a scientific paper published in 1989 and again in 1993 in The Self-Aware Universe, I arrived at the paradox-resolving proposition that the domain of potentiality is our consciousness, not in the form of ordinary ego consciousness, but as a higher consciousness in which we are all one. In manifest awareness, we become separate, partly due to the necessity of distinction from other objects, the subject-object distinction, and partly due to our individual conditioning. I also proposed that this higher one consciousness is causally empowered by downward causation, the capacity to choose among the many facets of a wave of possibility. It is conscious choice that transforms waves of possibility into particles of actuality. Philosopher and scientist Willis Harman, at the time president of the Institute of Noetic Science, IONS, was very supportive of my work. He invited me to write a monograph on my research. The new research soon created a new science, science within consciousness, a term I later discovered was already in vogue thanks to Harman. A monograph by the same name was published by IONS in 1994. Progress in the field came rapidly and was always accompanied by strange coincidences of Jungian synchronicity. First, an old woman called me on a radio talk show with the question, "What happens when we die?" I didn't know how to answer her without resorting to cultural cliches, so I kept quiet. Then a theosophist, a believer in reincarnation, took a course from me based on my book, The Self-Aware Universe, but ended up mostly talking about reincarnation. Soon after, I had a dream in which I woke up remembering this admonition: the Tibetan Book of the Dead is correct. It's your job to prove it. Finally, a graduate student of philosophy called me and asked me to help her mourn and overcome the impact of her boyfriend's death. It was while conversing with her and trying to theorize about what survives us in death that I began to see the possibility of a science of all our experiences: material sensing, sensation, vital feeling, energy, mental thinking, meaning, and supramental intuitions, archetypes like love and truth. From this I developed a theory of survival after death and reincarnation. Soon after, I got a call from author and editor Frank DeMarco asking me to write a book on my newest research. This appeared in 2001 under the title Physics of the Soul. Biophysicist Beverly Rubik called me in 1998 and asked me to contribute an article on my research to an anthology she was compiling. In 1999, I joined a group of 30 new paradigm thinkers at a conference with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, India. This conference turned fractious. First, physicist Fred Alan Wolf and I had a verbal battle over whose approach to the new paradigm was correct. Others joined in. The organizers complained to the Dalai Lama. He simply laughed and said scientists will be scientists. After peace was established, the Dalai Lama asked us to apply our new paradigm to social issues. This caught my attention. When I returned to the United States, I wrote the article Beverly Rubik had requested, applying quantum physics to health and healing. Here I developed a theory of what Deepak Chopra called quantum healing, spontaneous healing without medical intervention. Around the same time I visited Brazil, where a young man asked me if I knew Deepak Chopra. When I said I did not, he said, "I can correct that." Soon after, I got an invitation to visit Deepak in San Diego. He had just published his book Perfect Health, which discussed Ayurveda, an alternative healing system from India. He gave me a copy and asked me to read it. As a result, I ended up proving the scientific validity of an idea that physicians of alternative medicine have been using for millennia. Since we are more than our physical bodies, diseases in our subtle bodies can also be responsible for physical disease, especially chronic disease, and thus healing can be approached not only through curing physical symptoms, but also through healing disease at its more subtle source. Practitioners of the health sciences, physical and mental, deal with actual human beings. Thus, they do not always give their enthusiastic approval to the allopathic model of medicine, the more mechanical model that grew out of scientific materialism. When I wrote The Quantum Doctor, 2004, which dealt with integrating conventional mechanical medicine and more human alternative medicines, the quantum worldview began to get some traction among alternative medicine practitioners and even among some avant-garde allopaths. Deepak was so enthusiastic about the book that he wrote the foreword to a later edition. Medicine is based on biology. To relax the stranglehold of scientific materialism on medicine, we must introduce consciousness into biology. I began that work in the 1990s, and in 2008 proposed a consciousness-based scientific theory of evolution in my book Creative Evolution. This theory explains the fossil gaps and the biological arrow of time required for evolution to move from simplicity to complexity, two important pieces of data that Darwinism and its offshoots cannot explain. In Creative Evolution, I also integrated ideas of Sri Aurobindo and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin about the future of humanity into a scientific approach. I drew on ideas developed by Rupert Sheldrake about morphogenetic fields, blueprints for biological form-making, bringing them under the umbrella of science within consciousness. The biology establishment, however, has been very resistant to the influence of quantum physics, although, thanks to the empirical work on epigenetics and popular books by biologists Bruce Lipton, Mei-Wan Ho, and others, quantum biology is gradually gaining ground. In 2009, I set out to accelerate this paradigm shift by founding a movement called quantum activism. My goal was to popularize the quantum worldview by bringing together a group of people dedicated to transforming themselves and their societies through practicing quantum principles. This has gained some attention, not only in America, but also in Brazil, Europe, India, and Japan, and even in the Middle East. In 2014, I went to Japan for an extensive dialogue on the quantum worldview and quantum activism with erudite Japanese businessman and philosopher Masumi Hori. This book leans heavily on those dialogues. To these, I have added other interviews, notably one with author Eva Hare. The result is a sort of quantum physics 101 for non-scientists. It contains elements from all my previous work, and I hope it will inspire you to become a quantum activist. I hope to convince you that consciousness research and understanding of the quantum worldview is the future of science. It is the foundation of a new paradigm that can lead us to the answer to everything. Chapter 1. A Clash of Two Worldviews. People often ask me, if everything is not made of matter, then what is everything made of? And I say to them, consciousness. Everything is made of consciousness. But consciousness is such a woolly, nebulous concept. And this is where quantum physics breaks through with the answer we are looking for. For in a quantum worldview, everything is woolly, even matter. Everything is a possibility before we experience it. But if this is so straightforward, why do scientists debate about it? Scientists, in fact, still debate about all sorts of things. Is matter or consciousness the ground of everything? What does it mean to be human? Does God exist? While these are important questions, in our world of everyday affairs, what matters most is values. The biggest shortcoming of the materialist worldview is that it denigrates the archetypal values, love, truth, justice, beauty, goodness, abundance, and the meanings we derive from following these values. Yet to a majority of the world's population, values like love remain important. Quantum physics, on the other hand, brings with it a new worldview that can put value and meaning back into our lives and provide answers to the questions of who we are and what it means to be human. Someone once asked me if I found any similarity between quantum theory and the theory of the universe, and in fact the question is a good one. Quantum theory resulted from the observation of very tiny objects in the material world, the submicroscopic world. On the other hand, the theory of the universe is meant to explain a huge macro world. So how are these two related? In the quantum theory of consciousness, the large-scale aspects of the physical universe lose much of their interest. Modern cosmology has, thanks in large part to materialist science, avoided dealing with the internal world of consciousness. Thus, it no longer seems to have any relationship to the real problems that occupy us all the time. But the concepts of modern cosmology are merely escapes, distractions, not unlike the preoccupation of medieval Christian thinkers to determine how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. I find it interesting that scientific materialists often posit their own exciting gods. All the exotic knowledge we now have of outer space has become a modern replacement for the gods of earlier religions, from the archetypes of Plato to the angels of Christianity, to the more human Hindu gods like Shiva. Instead, today we call upon black holes and dark matter in an attempt to replace the archetypes and gods of earlier times. Modern science simply ignores consciousness and focuses instead on a concept of the universe that replaces archetypes and values with modern concepts like black holes and white holes, or dark matter and dark energy. What we need to recognize is that science should always consist of three components. It must be founded on a theory. That theory must be verifiable by experimental data, and that theory must be useful. It must be applicable to human affairs. Whereas consciousness studies are now producing useful, experimentally verifiable, and technologically useful objects of inquiry, modern materialist science increasingly involves itself with useless, non-verifiable objects of inquiry. Thus, objects that were previously deemed more esoteric and less scientific are now becoming more useful and more scientific. At the same time, what used to be practical, down-to-earth science is becoming more abstract and less useful, more like old spiritual traditions. And spiritual traditions are becoming more like science. What is consciousness? Scientific materialists tend to treat consciousness as a linguistic assumption. There are subjects and predicates in our language, but science claims we can do without the subjects. As an example, they give the Hopi language, which has no subjects or predicates, only verbs, eliminating the need for consciousness except as a linguistic element. Without subjects, without consciousness, everything is matter and the manifestation of material interaction. This is the dominant worldview among scientists today. If you ask a medical doctor to define consciousness, he will likely say, without batting an eye, that it is the opposite of being in a coma. A journalist told me her reaction to this kind of expert assertion. Here we are, stuck with huge problems like global warming, economic breakdown, and political polarization, all because we can't come to a meeting of the minds over what a term like consciousness means, and we are not even aware that there is no meeting of the minds. Of course, for many medical doctors, awareness and consciousness are synonymous, even after 100 years of Freud. Doctors rarely read any psychoanalytic literature, or if they do not accept much of it. Because how can the unconscious mind be validated if consciousness is not present in a patient who is in a coma? But consciousness never goes away. When we are unconscious, as in a coma, we may be unaware. We may have no experience of what is happening to us as subjects looking at objects, but we still have consciousness. What Freud really meant is that although there is a distinction between awareness and unawareness, both are states of consciousness. In one state, we are aware of a subject-object split. We have an experience with two poles, the subject, the experiencer, and the object, the experienced. But in an unconscious state, we have no awareness of this split. Through psychoanalysis, we can explore how the mental processes taking place in the unconscious, of which we are not aware, are bothering us in our waking states of awareness. According to Freud, we should try to identify and understand these unconscious processes in order to function well mentally. Consciousness is a fundamental aspect of our nature that is difficult to define, immediately at least. We can become aware of some aspects and attributes of consciousness, but that's all we can do. Because consciousness ultimately, according to the quantum worldview, is the ground of all being, any definition that you give of it will fall short. Consciousness is everything there is, so any way you try to define it, it will fall short, because the definition in itself is a phenomenon of consciousness, rather than the other way around. Now let's return to that fundamental question with which we began. What is everything made of? Apart from psychoanalysis, is there any other compelling reason to choose between consciousness and matter to answer this question? Fortunately, today we can scientifically refute the materialist worldview. Theoretically, we can do so by demonstrating paradoxes, logical knots of thinking. Experimentally, we can do so through anomalous data. Verbal quibbling has become unnecessary. Material interaction has certain properties. One is that all interactions, all communications, occur through connections, signals that pass through space and time. Today, however, even undergraduates in physics can verify signal-less communication between submicroscopic quantum objects. And the work that some quantum physicists are doing proves conclusively that we cannot understand quantum physics without introducing causally potent consciousness into it, without introducing not only consciousness, but also non-material consciousness with causal power. We get paradoxes otherwise. The causal power of consciousness, causation by conscious choice from potentiality into actuality, sounds much like the old Christian idea of downward causation by God. But that is not exactly true, although it is close enough to sound alarm bells in the cloistered minds of materialists. But here is the important thing. The new view of non-material downward causation is that it involves non-local communication, as opposed to communication with signals. Local communication goes through the locality to reach distant places, as, for example, when we communicate with sound. Sound is a local signal. When we communicate without signals, as in mental telepathy, that is non-local. With the concept of non-locality, we have an experimentally verifiable consequence of a consciousness-based metaphysic. Material interactions behave locally and require signals. When consciousness interacts with the world, it requires no signals, only non-local communication. True, this type of communication seems subjective, but objective experiments since 1982 have shown that there are indeed non-local interactions in the world. Thus, scientific materialism, based exclusively on material interactions, is ruled out experimentally. Instead, we can establish through experiment the idea that a new kind of non-material interaction exists in the world. We have a new kind of causation, the causal ability of consciousness. Signal-less communication. In the last few centuries, materialist science has been very busy deciphering the mysteries of matter. And in fact, it has developed technologies that were needed in order for our civilization to survive and move forward. These technologies have also produced some offshoots, however. We can't afford to put up with these negative consequences anymore, nor do we need to. Today's deepest scientific questions are about the large-scale structures of cosmology, and they're kind of useless. What is the practical use of studying black holes? We cannot verify them experimentally, and the research appears to have no purpose. So why spend so much time studying them? On the other hand, we have problems galore in the world: global climate change, terrorism and violence, economic meltdowns and corporate greed, people without jobs or trapped in meaningless work, politicians monopolizing power and disempowering people, political polarization, the skyrocketing cost of conventional health care, education that reinforces dogmas and ideologies without setting living examples of the values they preach. Solving all of these problems will require a change in the global mindset, a change in our collective consciousness. So we need to develop a different approach, a move away from the current scientific paradigm to one that includes consciousness, one that has the ability to integrate the power of consciousness into our everyday lives. We must recognize that it is when called on to explain consciousness that the materialist model of the world completely fails as an explanatory principle. Objects, material objects, can only yield other conglomerates of material objects. All objects, when taken together, can never yield a subject, and that's what human consciousness is all about. We are all subjects, looking at objects, looking at the world, formulating views about the world. Those who say those views all come from the dance of elementary particles at the basic level are just fooling themselves. They are ignoring the existence of meaning and values. They are denying that there is a causal efficacy at the level of human consciousness, at the very top level. Without values, there can be no civilization. So our entire civilization is in danger when we take the word of scientific materialists that matter is the ground of all being. Quantum physics, by contrast, suggests a worldview in which consciousness, not matter, is the ground of all being. It suggests a world where meaning and value can be reintroduced into science as aspects of consciousness beyond matter. This is the new approach to science that our society needs. Mainstream scientists have taken a very interesting approach to this critique, namely benign neglect. They hope to discredit this new approach through their silence, depriving proponents like myself an opportunity to engage in debate. But while mainstream science has chosen to ignore the work of quantum activists, we have used the time to develop a new science, uninterrupted by controversy. As a result, we now have a very good theory of consciousness based on quantum physics. Thanks to experimental researchers, we also have a lot of corroborating data. Scientific materialism relies on a concept called dualism, the idea that anything non-material must exist as a separate object, as its main justification for denying the role of consciousness and all other internal experiences. Dualism begs the question of how material and non-material objects interact. Think about it. If matter and non-matter have nothing in common, they need a mediator, a signal, to interact, something to connect them. This has proven a tough nut to crack for supporters of non-material beings. Quantum physics' answer is signalless communication, non-locality in technical jargon. Signal-less communication is impossible in space and time, so it must use another domain of reality outside of space and time. According to quantum physics, this is the domain of potentiality. If this is true, and experiments say that it is, all materialist arguments against dualism go away, returning value and meaning to spirituality, religion, the arts and humanities, and indeed to consciousness itself. And if dualism goes away, non-material objects can communicate with material objects and with other varieties of non-material objects, because no signal is needed for them to communicate through the domain of potentiality, also known as consciousness. Quantum physics forces us to conclude that the domain of potentiality is really consciousness itself. Moreover, it shows us that the communication between what seem to be two separate objects, mind and matter, is mediated by consciousness. This is the essence of the quantum paradigm. Sometimes materialists try to discredit the idea that quantum physics, quantum non-locality, can affect phenomena at the macro level of our experience. But we now have support from many experiments in a variety of fields, physics, biology, psychology, and medicine, that suggest...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?